Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Wizard of the Pigeons by Megan Lindholm, which is synonymous for Robin Hobb. Okay, so this is going to be another slightly odd review, because I have no desire to actually finish this book. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's not for me, and we're going to talk about it. So Wizard of the Pigeon introduces a character named Wizard, a man living rough on the streets of Seattle. He is an expert at blending in, being what people expect to see. He's a man that people instinctively know they can talk to, and who knows the truth no one could possibly know. He's a wizard. But in exchange for his magic, he cannot carry more than $1 on him at any time, he cannot be with a woman, and he must take care of his pigeons. He was taught to use his magic by Cassie, a woman who appears to him in different forms every time he meets her, who speaks in riddles, and who regularly threatens to eat his pigeons, but in a fun, friendly kind of way. But when a dark shadow appears in Seattle, looming over Wizard, he will have to face his past, a past that may swallow who he is now entirely. So this book is ultimately about the way our society traumatized and failed to support Vietnam veterans. And yeah, I was talking about it with my mom because this book was originally published the year I was born. And I feel like my childhood was set to the backdrop of the US society dealing with and shaming itself for failing to deal with what we did in Vietnam. It was the generational trauma of or one of the generational traumas, but it was the generational trauma of my parents' generation, which puts it in a very weird place for me, because I don't have that trauma, but I grew up seeing the trauma everywhere. Reading this book felt like someone was poking me repeatedly in a bruise I didn't remember getting, and hadn't noticed until someone poked it. I never had the original pain of the wound, but somehow the bruise is there giving me phantom tweaks. And this book lived in that space, which I honestly would have been fine with. I would have thought, like, that's a really interesting thing to evaluate, that's an interesting thing to look at, and an important part of history to deal with. But the way it deals with it is really not my jam. And that's not to say it's bad, it's just not for me. This book is written in such a way that you are left questioning over and over again, is the magic here real? Or is it Wizard's schizophrenic break brought on by likely PTSD and the complete lack of support he found back home? And I don't know, it just puts me in that place of desperately hoping for the fantasy to reintrude on reality and feeling guilty for wanting that. And I know that is sort of the point. A lot of what this book is doing is asking us to examine our own desire to look away, our own desire to desperately imagine another story, even if that means ignoring the truth about the world. But it's just too much for me. It really is. And specifically, the way when the ugly truth starts intruding its way through the fantasy in this book, it's all just melancholy and hopeless and grungy reality, where people are desperate to look away, incapable of actually hearing or seeing each other, where casual cruelty is a constant, even when someone seems to mean well. We are just damned to destroy each other. And that's just not for me. But I do want to talk about it outside of that perspective, like setting all that aside, because this book is doing some really interesting and cool things in really interesting ways. The first thing I really want to address is the voice of this book, because it is spectacular. This is set in Seattle. It's a low fantasy in the very classic sense. Like, this is our world, but with secret magic hidden beneath. Most people think the world has no magic, but there are wizards living among us. And this book has a sort of lovely fairy tale, Tolkien-esque, mythological tone that we tend to associate with high fantasy. Fantasy set in a different world. There's a certain subtly archaic sentence structure. There's a focus on the odd, the beautiful, and the whimsical within our world. There's a way of describing the mundane as if this book would expect us to have never seen it before. It all comes together to create this somewhat mundane setting, but to make it feel like a magic world. It's eye-opening, the way that art can sometimes remind us that of the beauty around us, remind us to really re-see it with new eyes. And I loved that. I loved the fact that the use of language draws the reader's eye to specifically where reader's mentality is. It's just an incredible work of using prose. And I do think there is actually currently a trend for high fantasy written like low fantasy, deliberately using contemporary syntax, contemporary language, and writing from the perspective of showing how these other magic worlds are like ours. And I think that's cool too. It's a great way of humanizing the narratives and making it more in-your-face obvious where the allegories for our world are. Also, this tends to make sometimes complex and dense stories more approachable to casual readers. And I love all that. That's why I write the way I write, because yes, I have long described my writing as high fantasy with a low fantasy tone. But the other side of that, low fantasy with a high fantasy tone, is something I honestly haven't seen very much, if at all. And it's absolutely cool. I really love it. It's doing this wonderful alchemic magic, merging our world with the imagined. And it's just a fascinating case study of how the style of prose can affect what the story is telling us. And I love the way magic is shown in this book. It's soft and gentle and all about balance. All the wizards have taboos specific to them, things that they cannot do if they want to retain their magic, which is a cool idea that I have heard from a couple of different real-world folklore traditions, but I've never actually seen integrated into a fantasy book. And I love the stuff it has to say about how power is not something you grasp, but something you give. And it's magic that I totally buy being part of our world without people realizing it exists. Like, so often when you're reading low fantasy, you're like, how do people not know that? Like, you sort of have to imagine as another world, even if it is meant to be our world. Whereas this one, I can totally map it onto our world and have no problem with that. And so much of the magic in this book is the sort of magic that could just be the way the characters see the world, rather than something they are actively doing to change reality. But those changes are there, and it's this lovely balance of reality versus unreality. And with that comes a main character who is beautifully gentle and soft. His power is in listening and knowing. He's receptive and passive, and I love that kind of hero. Like, it is so contradictory to what we tend to see as the classic male hero that I love them whenever they pop up. Now, that being said, as his battle against the Shadow progresses, we do actually see another side of him, and really so much of his fight throughout the book is against his own more violent side. And there is still a passivity to him when he is more violent, and it's a really odd contrast. And the thing is, I do not mind a passive main character. I know a lot of people do say passive main characters are not good. I like a passive main character. I sometimes really love it when a story just drags a character along until the moment they finally must make one choice that changes everything, or they're backed into a corner and are forced to strike out, or they learn how to stand up for themselves at the very last minute. And that moment can be the very last minute for me. Like, I am 100% okay with reading a book that is 90% the character just going along with shit, and the last 10% being them actually standing up and saying no. But in this book, one of the hardest things for me was watching this kind, gentle man of simple pleasures be dragged under the tide of violence and despair. And I think for me, it's the line that I draw is, I'm fine with the narrative dragging a character through actions that fit my perception of that character, but it hurts my soul in a certain way to see a character forced to be someone they clearly do not want to be. Like, it was one of those books that I just kept wanting to throw it across the room and scream, "Wizard, just tell her no. Oh my god, you can walk away. Even if she's in your den, you can still just refuse to play her game." And I knew we were going to be getting there eventually, but it's like 100 pages of watching him just let the world shape him into someone he clearly does not want to be. But I think that is ultimately what this book is about. So I can't really blame it for accomplishing exactly what it set out to accomplish. I just didn't want to see it. And overall, I feel like we spent too long with Wizard at his lowest point for me. Too long with him letting his self-destructive side turn him into someone he didn't like. And it's odd because I love me some self-destructive characters. Like, oh my god, if you give me a character who is sabotaging himself, I am in for it. But this one really didn't work for me. I also want to talk a bit about one element of the wizardry in this book. All the wizards that we meet, at least, are implied to live rough. Like, Cassie definitely has her own places, but they are outside of reality. Euripides is a busker, someone who plays music for money on the side of the road. Rasputin spends all of his time in a park, as far as we can tell. He, like, hangs out in park benches. Wizard lives in abandoned buildings. It fits the tradition of wizards as outsiders trope, and that works for me really well. And all the wizards have behaviors that we see in real people, in the real world, living rough. But there's a magic explanation for all these behaviors. Like, Rasputin is constantly dancing because it's part of his magic, but to an outsider who didn't know better, he would likely look like someone who is just stimming. It asks us to reevaluate the behavior we see in the real world and the behavior that we tend to dismiss as just homeless people acting crazy. It humanizes unhoused people. And I think that's absolutely spectacular. I love the fact that we see how Wizard got to the place where he is living in abandoned buildings, though that is honestly the scene that I found the most harrowing to read. Like, oh my god, that one killed me. And we get to see the roadblocks that lined up to force him outside of society. We see how society abandoned him, and it's all beautifully humanizing. And I really do think humanizing homeless people is really fucking important. But that being said, there were a couple of scenes where Wizard is basically comparing himself to those other homeless people. He's thinking about how he disguises the fact that he's living rough and how other people living rough could do this too if they just saw the trick of it, but he shouldn't bother teaching them because they'll never learn on their own and therefore never be able to do it. And that felt so much like Wizard espousing the idea that he's homeless, but he's not like those other people. And yeah, the book does refute that, because eventually Wizard stops being able to play the roles he used to. People start seeing through his costumes, and they start throwing him out of places. They start refusing to serve him. They start generally treating him like trash, like they treat the other homeless people. And that definitely is the book asking readers to see that it was never about the other people living rough incorrectly. It was just that Wizard was lucky enough to have magic to help him pass, which is definitely saying something. But I just really craved the book being a little bit more direct about this. Like, I really wanted there to be a direct statement that these few wizards are not the good homeless people and we should care about them, versus bad homeless people that we can't help and so shouldn't bother trying. And I know that that might have felt a little bit preachy, and like that is a fault of a lot of late 80s, early 90s fantasy. It does tend to get a bit preachy. But in this particular case, I just really wanted it to be a bit more on the nose with that, because some readers aren't going to get that. But that leads me to talking about Linda, because I think objectively I would have finished reading this book if it weren't for Linda. She is also a wildly self-destructive character, but in a specific way that makes me want to break shit. She's the woman who seeks out abusive men. She's the woman who makes assumptions about what the men around her need and refuse to take no for an answer. She's the woman who sees someone spiraling and instead of reaching out into the whirlpool to pull them up, instead just dives in, grabs on, and sinks, pulling them down further and faster than he would ever go on his own. And I feel like, for a long while, this type of character was the avatar our media tended to choose for abused women. So often, women in abusive relationships have been shown in books and movies and TV as passively self-destructive, making the situation worse without intending to, causing their own problems because they just hate themselves so much they can't help it. And that fucking sucks, because most people who end up in abusive relationships are not self-destructively seeking it out. They are just trapped. They've been manipulated. It's not their fault. And I understand that this book was published in 1986. This book is nearly 40 years old, which means I'm nearly 40 years old. God fucking bless. But the important thing is the fact that this is as unproblematic as it manages to be is damn impressive. But Linda bothered me because her presentation is subtle enough to be insidious. And I don't mean that I think the author was trying to victim blame her or sneak in victim blaming into the book. I just mean that she represents the quiet kind of cultural messaging that we are likely to miss because we're so used to it. And so we don't think to stop and deconstruct it. And that can be really dangerous. And once again, like most of these cases, if she was a standalone character and that archetype did not exist in the rest of the world, I would have no problems with it and just be like, I didn't like that character. But because she does represent this really bad archetype, it's a problem. And yeah, overall, I think this is a good book, though I would not say that with 100% surety because I didn't actually finish it. I skimmed the last 40-ish pages and then read the last chapter so I could categorize it in my mind as done and set it aside. But presuming I didn't miss something horrible in the last chapters, it's not bad at all. It's beautifully written, it's got a really interesting story to tell, and one that I feel like is doing some really interesting, wonderful things. I love the fact that it's all about reclaiming magic and not letting the heaviness of reality drown us. I think the characters are wonderful, other than Linda, and there's some really fabulous humanization of often dehumanized populations going on in this book. I'm guessing this book would be really deeply cathartic and powerful for people who have gone through war and the failures of American mental health care system to help people with trauma. It's got really deeply complex and likable characters, especially the main character. Like, I really liked Wizard. It was just too heavy for me, especially right now. Like, I just couldn't handle it. So, yeah, I do suggest picking this one up if you're in the right mindset and if really heavy, dark, emotional reads are cathartic for you and not just harmful. So it's up to you.